She had been warned. Multiple people had warned her, clearly and directly, in plain language. She went in anyway, and she survived. But she was the only one who did, and living through something that killed everyone else around you is its own particular kind of sentence. It was October 2007, and Helena Carroll was 24 years old, on holiday in the Surat Thani province of southern Thailand with her boyfriend John Cullen. They had heard about Nam Talu Cave in Khao Sok National Park from other travelers, one of those wild adventure experiences that gets whispered about in hostel common rooms, the kind of thing that sounds too dramatic to be true until you look it up and find out it's even more dramatic than described. The cave was accessible only after a 2-hour boat crossing of a vast emerald lake surrounded by jungle limestone cliffs, followed by a 2-hour trek through dense, dripping rainforest. You paid a guide, you signed your name, you went inside, and you came back out, and you had a story. They signed up, they paid, they showed up at the meeting point ready to go. People warned them not to. It was the heart of monsoon season. The province governor had already issued a formal order closing the cave to tourism. The local people who lived near the park understood the October weather in that region from long experience. The rains came with almost no warning, sometimes within minutes, and when they did, the Nam Talu Cave system channeled the water that fell on the jungle above it the way a funnel channels water into a bottle. Fast, completely, all at once. The locals knew this because the rains had done it before. They knew the sound it made. They knew how much time you had when you heard it, which was not enough time. But when Helena and John arrived, they were not the only ones who had signed up. There was a Swiss couple with 2 teenage daughters. There was a 10-year-old German boy traveling with his father who had decided at the last moment not to join. 2 Thai guides were leading the group. The warnings were mentioned, and the group looked at each other and looked at the clear morning sky and looked at the signs posted at the entrance in English and other languages and made the collective calculation that most people make in those situations, that the warnings applied to other people, to careless people, to people who were not paying attention the way this group was paying attention. They had guides. There were rules posted. How dangerous could it actually be? 20 minutes into the cave, Helena Carroll heard something she had never heard before and would never forget for the remainder of her life. It came from behind them, from the direction of the entrance they had walked through 20 minutes ago, a sound like a freight train, a deep, resonant, building roar that filled the cave tunnel completely and seemed to compress the air in front of it as it came. It was the sound of a mountain eating water and having no place left to put it. Helena turned around. The water hit like a wall of concrete. There was no rising flood, no gradual increase in water level, no slow creep across the stone floor. One moment the passage was stone and dim lamplight. The next, a torrent of brown water moving at terrifying velocity exploded through the cave tunnel, carrying with it everything the storm had driven into the mountain above. Mud in thick suspension, broken branches, loose rocks, anything that had been on the jungle floor moments before. The guides' flashlights were ripped away in the first second of the surge. The entire group was plunged into absolute darkness and absolute noise simultaneously. Helena heard screaming. Then she heard only the water. John seized her arm in the dark. They scrambled together upward along the cave wall, fingers digging into whatever holds the limestone offered in the pitch black, the torrent tearing at their legs and trying to rip them off the wall and carry them with it. Helena found a ledge above the floodline, a narrow shelf in the rock, and hauled herself onto it with everything she had. John was beside her, breathing in ragged gasps. Below them, the water surged and roared in the total dark. There was no way to see how deep it was. There was no way to see anything at all. John Cullen made a decision. The ledge was barely large enough for one person, and he was a practical man who loved her and was thinking as clearly as a person can think with floodwater roaring 3 feet below his boots. He told Helena that he was going to lower himself into the current and ride it to the exit, that caves like this were not long, that the entrance was not far, that the current would carry him fast and he would be outside in minutes, that he would bring rescuers back for her, and that she simply needed to hold on, that he would be back, that she just needed to hold on. She watched him lower himself off the ledge into the dark water. The current took him immediately. He was gone. Helena Carroll sat alone in total darkness on a narrow shelf of limestone inside a flooded cave deep inside a jungle mountain in southern Thailand, and she waited. She could not see her own hands. She did not know if John had made it out. She did not know if the water below her was still rising. She did not know if anyone outside the cave was aware that anyone was still inside it. She sat in the dark for 8 hours. She did not speak. She had no light. She counted her own breathing. She thought about John. She thought about the sound the water made when it took him. She sat on a shelf of rock that she could not see and waited for something, anything, to change. Rescuers had known almost immediately that people were missing inside the cave. What they had not known was how far in. The flooding had been so fast and so total that the initial rescue attempts could not penetrate the entrance at all, and each attempt pushed rescuers back. One Thai guide at some point in the night refused to accept that there was no one left to find. He pushed further than the others had been willing to go, further than the conditions justified on any rational calculation, deeper into the cave past the point where most of his colleagues had turned back. He was right to do it. He found Helena Carroll on her ledge, alive, cold, and not speaking. She had been inside the cave for 16 hours in total when he reached her. She was helped out through the remaining floodwater and into the forest beyond the cave entrance, into the noise and the lights and the chaos of the rescue operation assembled outside. They were leading her toward the ambulances. She kept asking about John. She kept asking whether anyone had seen John. Someone finally told her the truth. John Cullen was dead. Every other person who had entered the cave that morning was dead. The Swiss couple, their 2 daughters, the 10-year-old German boy, both guides. Their bodies were already laid out on the grass near the cave entrance when Helena was helped past. 8 people had walked into Nam Talu Cave that morning. 1 walked out. Helena has tried for years to find the rescuer who refused to give up when the others turned back, the man who pushed into the cave alone past the point of reasonable effort and found her on her shelf in the dark and brought her out. She has never been able to identify him. She does not know his name. The cave at Khao Sok was never properly and permanently closed after the 2007 deaths. In 2024, 17 years later, a Thai tour guide led another group into Nam Talu Cave during a restricted period of the monsoon season. He slipped in the floodwater inside the cave. His body was found inside. The roar came without warning. It always does. That is the only thing about Nam Talu Cave that has never once changed. There is a frozen pond in a narrow valley in northern Norway that looks, from above, like nothing at all. A flat disk of winter ice between snow-covered hills. A shepherd might walk past it 100 times and find nothing worth noting. But beneath the ice, the water drops away without warning into one of the most demanding cave diving systems in the world, a passage that descends to 130 meters below the surface, deeper than most buildings are tall, and then squeezes through narrow stone corridors for more than half a kilometer before finally rising into a dry cave chamber on the far side of the mountain. The full traverse takes approximately 5 hours. The depth alone puts it beyond the reach of all but the most experienced technical divers in the world. On the morning of February 6, 2014, 5 Finnish cave divers arrived at the Plura Pond in the Nordland region of Norway in the early pre-dawn hours, stiff from a long road journey over icy Norwegian mountain highways. They unloaded their gear in the freezing dark, 60 kilograms of equipment for each diver, including dry suits, closed-circuit rebreather systems, underwater propulsion vehicles, and multiple independent bailout gas cylinders for emergencies. They picked up a chainsaw and cut a triangular hole in the surface ice, the sound of it cutting through the pre-dawn silence of the valley. They had planned this dive together for months. They knew every segment of the route. They had studied every known hazard, briefed every contingency. Their names were Patrick Grönqvist, Jari Huotarinen, Vesa Rantanen, Jari Uusimäki, and Kai Kenkinen. They had been diving together for years, long enough to have built the kind of trust that develops only from putting your life into someone else's hands repeatedly in environments where a single mistake ends everything. Patrick was a professional firefighter in Finland. He had been part of the expedition that first discovered this precise route through the Plura system the previous year. For all 5 of them, this cave, this dive, this particular combination of depth and darkness and stone was the closest thing they had to a spiritual practice. This was what fully alive felt like to them. They divided into 2 teams. Patrick Grönqvist and Jari Huotarinen would enter first and make the full traverse to the exit on the other side of the mountain. Vesa Rantanen, Jari Uusimäki, and Kai Kenkinen would follow 2 hours behind using the same route. Both teams would surface on the other side and return together. No one had prepared a contingency for what happens when the first team encounters a catastrophe so total that they have absolutely no way to warn the second team before the second team descends into the same space. Approximately 1 hour into the dive, at a depth of 110 meters, Patrick Grönqvist became aware that Jari Huotarinen was no longer behind him. He turned back through the passage in the direction he had come, every extra minute spent at depth adding to the mandatory decompression time that would be required before he could safely surface, and found Jari tangled in the umbilical line tethered to his underwater scooter. The passage at that point was too narrow to maneuver with the equipment attached. Jari had become immobilized, and he was starting to panic. Panic at extreme depth is physiologically fatal in a way that is almost invisible from the outside. A panicking diver breathes faster and more shallowly. Faster breathing overloads the carbon dioxide scrubber in a closed-circuit rebreather, the component that removes CO2 from the recycled gas the diver breathes. When the scrubber is overwhelmed, it begins to fail silently. The diver continues breathing normally and begins to absorb carbon dioxide into their bloodstream without any sensation of suffocation or alarm. Within 2 to 4 minutes, they lose consciousness. In the conditions of Plura Cave at 110 meters, unconsciousness is death. Patrick passed his emergency bailout gas cylinder to Jari. Jari took several urgent breaths from it and then attempted to switch his mouthpiece, exchanging the rebreather mouthpiece for the bailout regulator while hovering in the dark at 90 meters of depth, wedged in a stone passage barely wide enough for a human body, with a current of cold black water pressing against him and his hands moving inside thick diving gloves. Jari Huotarinen accidentally inhaled water. He died in the passage within minutes. He died with Patrick beside him, watching, close enough to touch and completely unable to change what was happening. Patrick Grönqvist held onto the cave wall and forced himself to breathe with deliberate mechanical slowness, the way he had been trained to breathe walking into a burning building, one controlled breath at a time. He was still at depth. He could not ascend directly. The pressure differential at 100 meters required hours of staged decompression stops at progressively shallower depths before he could safely reach the surface, and surfacing too fast would kill him as surely as the water had killed Jari. He could not go back the way he had come. Returning through the full depth of the Plura system from this point would take 10 or more additional hours of diving and decompression. His only available exit was forward through the remaining half-kilometer of passage, across the deep sections, and up through the far exit on the other side of the mountain. He left Jari's body where it was. He turned forward into the dark and kept moving. 2 hours after Patrick and Jari had descended, the second team entered the ice hole in the surface and began their dive, completely unaware that one of the men they were following was dead in the passage ahead. When Vesa Rantanen reached the section of passage where Jari's body rested in the cave floor, he made the devastating calculation that most people would not be able to make, and he squeezed past. But when the next diver, Jari Uusimäki, came through and his headlamp illuminated his colleague's body in the rock ahead of him, the panic was instantaneous and total. He turned back. Kai Kenkinen followed, attempting to help. Jari Uusimäki died in the passage before they could exit the cave, in the same darkness, at nearly the same depth as the man whose body had startled him. Kai Kenkinen survived. He spent 11 hours navigating back through the deep sections of the cave alone, completing his mandatory decompression stops in total silence and total darkness, and finally broke through the ice surface of the Plura Pond. The rescue teams waiting above had not known any of this was happening. Norwegian authorities declared the cave too dangerous for body recovery and sealed it. A British team of elite cave divers made an attempt and turned back. Jari Huotarinen and Jari Uusimäki remained where they had died, at 130 meters below the surface of the Norwegian winter. Then Patrick Grönqvist went to see Jari Huotarinen's widow. He looked at her directly and told her that her husband was not going to be left in the mountain. He promised her this. He then assembled a covert team of Finnish and Norwegian cave divers, planned the recovery with the obsessive thoroughness of people who understood that a single failure at that depth meant becoming part of the problem they had come to solve, and arrived at the Plura Pond in unmarked vehicles in the middle of the night 7 weeks after the accident. The recovery was technically illegal. They did it anyway. On March 24, 2014, Patrick descended again into Plura Cave, into the passage where his closest friend had died, past the section of wall where he had held on and forced himself to breathe slowly, back down to 130 meters in the dark, and he found Jari Huotarinen exactly where he had left him 7 weeks before. Motionless, peaceful, still in his dry suit, still in the cold and the silence at the bottom of the world, exactly as Patrick had promised he would not remain. There is a documentary film called Diving into the Unknown that records this recovery. It is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of cinema ever made, not because of what it shows, but because of the faces of the men doing the diving. The absolute weight of a promise kept in a place where almost no one else on Earth could have gone to keep it. Some people leave the dark, some people go back into it, and some people go back into it twice. It was a beautiful summer morning when they went in. By that same evening, 6 of them were dead, and the cave would be sealed forever over their bodies. On June 24, 1967, a group of 10 cavers descended into the Mossdale Caverns in the Yorkshire Dales of northern England. Most of them young men in their late teens and early 20s, students and enthusiasts connected to Leeds University and local caving clubs who gathered on weekends to push deeper into the limestone networks beneath the moors. The eldest in the group was 26 years old, the youngest was 17. Their informal leader was a man named Dave Adamson, an experienced and respected caver who knew the Mossdale system well enough to navigate its worst passages. He was engaged to be married in 6 weeks. His fiancée was a woman named Morag Forbes, and she was one of the 10 who descended into the cave that morning. Mossdale had a reputation among serious cavers. It was not a beginner's system. Its passages were long, wet, brutally tight, low crawlways through black mud and standing water, some requiring hours of horizontal shuffling with barely enough vertical clearance to turn one's head. The cave ran underneath the open moorland above, connected to the moor's surface drainage in ways that made it extraordinarily dangerous in wet weather. But the group knew the cave and the weather that morning gave no concern. They had been in it before, some of them many times. The sky above the Yorkshire moors was clear blue, and the moorland grasses were summer green, and there was absolutely nothing visible from the surface to suggest that by nightfall everything would be destroyed. After several hours of exploration, 4 members of the group chose to turn back. They were tired, they had seen what they came to see, and the squeeze back through the tightest sections was always harder than the push in. Morag Forbes was among the 4 who turned back. She squeezed through the low entrance passage and pulled herself out onto the surface, blinking in the afternoon light. What she found waiting for her on the surface was not an afternoon, it was a disaster already in progress. While the group had been underground, a storm had broken over the Yorkshire moors above, sudden, severe, and completely invisible from inside the cave, where no sound from the surface ever penetrates. Mossdale Beck, the small stream that fed into the cave entrance, had transformed from its normal trickle into a roaring brown flood that was pouring directly into the cave mouth at tremendous volume. When Morag reached the entrance, it was completely submerged. The 6 men who had pushed further into the cave, Dave Adamson and 5 others, were now sealed inside a rapidly flooding cave system with no way out and no warning that anything had changed at all. Morag Forbes ran. She did not stop to assess or to plan. She ran 4 kilometers across open moorland in caving boots, over rough grass and wet ground, toward the nearest farm to raise an alarm. She ran the way a person runs when they understand with perfect clarity that the difference between fast enough and not quite fast enough is measured in lives. The alarm went out through every caving club and emergency service in Yorkshire and beyond. Over 200 rescue workers converged on Mossdale before morning was done. They faced a problem with no clean solution. The flood was total, the entrance was buried under rushing water, and there was no way to simply wait it out, because every minute that passed was a minute less for the 6 men inside. Engineers and volunteers dug a massive diversion trench through the night, 6 feet wide, 10 feet deep, 100 yards long, attempting to redirect enough of the floodwater away from the cave entrance to allow entry. They also built an emergency earthen dam. They worked through the darkness with shovels and machinery and the particular furious energy of people who know exactly what is at stake and are not yet ready to stop believing it can still end differently. When the water finally dropped enough to allow entry, a rescue team pushed in. The passages of Mossdale on a dry day were already formidable, long crawlways through cold mud and standing water, the kind of spaces that eat time and crush courage. Now they were choked with flood debris, tangled with debris the water had carried in, and in several places nearly completely blocked. The team moved slowly, methodically, pushing deeper into the system toward where the group was believed to have been exploring. In a section of the cave called Far Marathon, 900 feet long, 2 feet wide, 10 inches high at its lowest point, team member Tony Waltham was leading the advance. He crawled forward into the darkness with his headlamp throwing light on the mud-slicked walls close on either side. He found the first 2 bodies in the passage itself, wedged into the crawlway by the force of the water. He made the decision to crawl over them. 3 more were in the passages just beyond. By the time the rest of his team had forced themselves through to where he was, several experienced adult rescue workers were weeping in the dark, faces pressed against the mud, unable to proceed. Waltham turned back to the team leader behind him and said, with the directness of a man who has no useful alternative, "Go back, Jim, they're all dead." The sixth caver, 21-year-old John Ogden, was not among the 5 bodies found in Far Marathon. John Ogden was one of the most skilled cavers in the group, experienced, technically proficient, the kind of person who might, in some thin margin of possibility, have found an air pocket, a ledge, a fragment of survivable space. Rescue teams came back over the following days. They made the crawl past the bodies of Ogden's 5 companions again and again, searching further into the cave with the desperate repetition of people who are not yet ready to accept what they already know. They found his gold signet ring first, placed deliberately in a visible spot in the passage, a marker left by a man who was still thinking clearly enough to leave signs for the people he believed were coming for him. Then they found the sole of his boot, separated by the force of the water. Then, squeezed into a crack beyond anywhere the water should have permitted a person to reach, they found John Ogden. He had fought further into the cave than any of the others, clawing through the flooding passages toward a pocket of breathable air that did not exist. He had made it further than should have been possible. It was not far enough. The coroner sealed the cave. The 6 bodies were declared impossible to recover safely without endangering additional lives. Dave Adamson, Jeff Boireau, Bill Frakes, John Ogden, Michael Ryan, and Colin Vickers were left where the flood had placed them, entombed in the Yorkshire limestone, in the dark, in the cold, in the cave they had entered on a bright summer morning 6 weeks before a wedding that never happened. 4 years later, a small and quietly determined group of fellow cavers from the same clubs and communities broke through the sealed entrance in secret, under cover of night, without authorization from any authority. They moved the 6 bodies to a deeper chamber above the floodline, a place where the water could never reach them again no matter how hard the moors rained, and they gave it a name. They called it the Sanctuary, which is exactly what it was and what it remains. On the moorland surface above Mossdale, a stone cairn was built at the spot where the beck meets the cave entrance. The inscription reads, Mossdale Memorial Cairn, over the place in the cave where the bodies were found. The cave itself remains sealed. No access is granted for any reason. The official caving guidebooks list the Mossdale Caverns with a notation that has not changed in decades. Warning, liable to total flooding, all expeditions inadvisable. Some cavers go in anyway. They know the history. They have read the names. They pick a clear, dry morning when there is not a cloud anywhere over the Yorkshire moors, and they go in because they believe that this time the weather will hold. It was clear and dry and summer green the morning Dave Adamson's group went in too. It was the night before Thanksgiving when John Jones made the decision that would seal his fate inside a mountain of Utah rock forever. He was 26 years old, a medical student at a prestigious program already 3 years deep into training that would make him a doctor. A devoted husband to his wife Emily, who was home that evening tending to their 1-year-old daughter and already well into her 2nd pregnancy. By all accounts, John Jones was exactly the kind of person who made the world feel steadier just by being in it, calm under pressure, deeply faithful, grounded in a way that most people spend entire lifetimes trying to achieve and never quite manage. He was not the reckless type. He was not someone who took needless chances with the things that mattered. He had planned this trip weeks in advance with his brother Josh and a group of 10 close friends, a caving adventure in the Utah desert the evening before Thanksgiving, a last bit of wildness before the warm gathering of family and food and gratitude. He had made a proper reservation. He had signed the liability waiver. He had kissed his daughter on the forehead and told her he would be back for pie. Nutty Putty Cave sat roughly 50 miles south of Salt Lake City, a limestone labyrinth bored into the desert hills by ancient water and time, and it had been drawing adventure seekers for years. The cave's passages bore names that should have registered as warnings to anyone paying close attention. The Birth Canal, the Scout Eater, the Aorta Crawl. These were not playful nicknames assigned carelessly by people with a taste for drama. They were anatomical descriptions of what each passage physically demanded from the human body, trying to force itself through, and the people who named them had chosen every word with a kind of brutal accuracy that experience teaches and cannot be taught any other way. In the years leading up to November 2009, rescue teams had been summoned to Nutty Putty Cave 5 separate times to extract cavers who had become wedged in the stone and could not free themselves. The cave had previously been shut down by state authorities over serious safety concerns, then reopened just 6 months before this night under new management with new protocols and new regulations. There were reservation systems now, there were posted rules, there were rangers on site. For the first hour of the trip, everything unfolded exactly as it was supposed to. The group moved happily through the cave's upper passages, laughing at the tight spots, pressing through narrow crawlways with headlamps catching the glittering formations in the walls around them. They experienced the particular sharp thrill that comes only from being sealed inside the living body of the earth with people you love and trust. Then John decided to find a specific passage called the Birth Canal, one of Nutty Putty's signature experiences, a claustrophobic crawlway that was tight enough to challenge even experienced cavers. He separated from the group and squeezed into a narrow fissure he believed was the correct tunnel. He lowered himself in head first, stomach down, arms pressed flat against his sides, and began inching forward by flexing his shoulders and pushing with his hips. The passage tilted downward sharply. He told himself there would be an opening at the far end, a chamber, a reward. He pushed deeper still. There was no opening. He had entered the completely wrong passage. John Jones found himself inverted inside a vertical crack in the limestone that measured 10 inches wide and 18 inches deep, locked at a 70-degree downward angle, 400 feet from the cave entrance and still moving away from it. His arms were pinned completely flat against his torso by the walls pressing on both sides. He could not raise his head, he could not bend at the waist, he could not push forward any further, and he could not work himself backward. The rock held him the way a closed fist holds something it has quietly decided not to release. His brother Josh located him within minutes. He seized John's ankles and pulled with everything he had in him. John did not move a single measurable inch. Josh called out to the group with a voice that was controlled and very flat. Then he dialed 911 from a phone that could barely pull a signal in the stone, his fingers trembling against the screen. Over the next 27 hours, 137 rescue workers converged on the site. Paramedics, structural engineers, professional cavers, cave rescue specialists. A full command center was established in the desert outside. Floodlights obliterated the night and turned the hillside as bright as midday. Emily drove out and took up her position at the cave entrance wrapped in a heavy coat, holding their daughter against her chest, watching the ambulances idle in the cold dark and waiting for a man she had no reason yet to stop believing in. The fissure where John was trapped was so catastrophically narrow that only 6 human beings could physically reach him at all. The remaining 100-plus rescue workers were functionally useless beyond the staging area, unable to contribute anything beyond the weight of their presence. Paramedics threaded intravenous lines through the passage to deliver fluids. Engineers drilled steel anchor bolts into the cave wall and constructed a pulley system of 15 tandem blocks, 8 workers at the ropes pulling in perfectly coordinated heaves. For one extraordinary, disbelieving moment, it worked. John's body began to inch upward through the stone. The rescuer closest to his face could see his expression clearly in the lamplight. John was looking back with a trembling, exhausted smile, the smile of a man who understood that the nightmare was ending. The anchor bolt failed catastrophically. The rope went completely slack. The team fell backward. John plunged deeper into the fissure than he had been at any point since becoming trapped, deeper now than before the rescue attempt had even begun. He had been inverted for over 20 hours. The human cardiovascular system is not engineered for sustained inversion. Blood migrates progressively upward into the brain and into the chest cavity. The heart, working against gravity with every single contraction, begins to strain in ways it cannot sustain indefinitely. Fluid accumulates inside the lungs in the condition physicians call pulmonary edema. The trauma doctor monitoring John from the narrow passage beside him understood exactly what the physiology meant. Every hour added to the inversion was another hour of irreversible internal damage, accruing silently, organ by organ, without a single visible wound to mark what was happening inside him. In the final hours of his life, John spoke to Emily by radio through the rock. She was 30 feet above him through solid limestone, and he told her clearly that he loved her. He asked about their daughter by name. He made a small, quiet joke that made the rescuer beside him look away. He comforted the men and women who had pressed themselves into the dark passage to be with him, comforted them when comfort was the thing they should have been giving him. Rescuer Brandon Kowallis would later describe how, in those final hours, John spoke about seeing figures moving in the cave shadows around him. Some of them were angels, he said. Some of them were something else. He described them not with fear, but with a strange, drifting, dissociated calm that those present found more deeply unnerving than any amount of screaming could have been. His breathing had become wet and labored and very slow by then, dragging itself along like something that had already given most of what it had. At 11:56 p.m. on November 25, 2009, John Edward Jones died of cardiac arrest inside Nutty Putty Cave. He was still inverted. He was still 400 feet from the entrance. He was still wearing the smile that the last photograph captured, because right up until nearly the end, he had genuinely believed the rope was going to hold this time. Recovering his body was deemed too dangerous. The rock around the fissure had fractured badly during the rescue attempts. On December 9th, state authorities detonated explosives inside Nutty Putty Cave and collapsed the ceiling above John's position. Then they poured concrete into every entrance, every crack, every opening they could identify. The cave was sealed permanently. It will never be opened again for any reason. John Edward Jones is still inside, still inverted, still in the dark. His wife Emily eventually remarried, moved, and rebuilt a life, and still, years later, strangers recognize her face in grocery stores and parking lots and school hallways, and they stop her with that particular expression that has no clean single name, and they say quietly, "I know who you are." Some graves have headstones with dates carved into marble and flowers placed there on weekends. Some are sealed forever with poured concrete in the Utah desert, and the man inside is 26 years old for eternity, and the last thing he felt before the dark arrived was a rope going completely and finally slack. Nobody warned Floyd Collins that the January morning he dropped into Sand Cave in Kentucky would be the last time he would ever see open sky. Then again, no warning could have prepared him for what the earth had quietly decided to do with him. Floyd Collins was 37 years old in the winter of 1925, born and raised in the limestone hill country of Kentucky, and he had been exploring caves since he was 6 years old. Since childhood, he had been crawling through underground passages with nothing but a kerosene lantern to hold the dark back, navigating by instinct and the particular brand of fearlessness that grows in people who have spent years in places that would shatter most others. He was not an educated man in the formal sense. He had barely finished primary school, but underground, Floyd Collins was as gifted as any person alive. He had already discovered one remarkable cave system on his family's property, a glittering underground world he named Crystal Cave for the formations that covered its walls like a cathedral's windows catching light. It should have made his fortune. It did not. Crystal Cave was located too far from the main highway. Tourists and paying visitors would not make the extra journey. The automobile was reshaping America, and in 1925, if your attraction was not close to a road, you were invisible to the world above ground. Floyd understood this problem with the focused intensity of a man who had been thinking about it for years, and he had been scouting the surrounding fields looking for a solution. He was convinced there was something spectacular just below the surface of a particular stretch of land near the Mammoth Cave area, something close to the road, something the tourists would actually drive to see, something that would finally change everything for the Collins family. On the morning of January 30th, 1925, he lowered himself alone into a narrow hole in the ground on a neighbor's property that would later be named Sand Cave. He moved through the initial passages on his stomach, pushing his kerosene lantern ahead of him through crawlways sometimes only 9 or 10 inches high, the limestone pressing against his back and his chest at the same time. An hour into the descent, he found exactly what he had been dreaming of finding, a vaulted underground chamber of genuine beauty, enormous and cathedral quiet, with formations rising from the floor like frozen waterfalls. And it was barely 300 feet from the cave entrance. The main highway was within easy sight distance above. This was the one. After years of searching, this was finally the cave that would change everything. Then his lantern began to flicker. Floyd moved fast. He understood better than almost any person alive what it meant to lose your light underground. He turned himself around in the narrow passage and began pushing back toward the entrance, moving with urgency now, pushing with his hips and elbows while the flame guttered and threw strange shadows. His left foot caught on what he believed was a solid shelf of rock. The passage shifted, and a boulder estimated at 27 pounds dropped from the ceiling directly onto his left ankle, pinning it completely against the cave floor. He was 55 feet below the surface. He was entirely alone. The lantern burned out its final drops of fuel. He began calling for help in the absolute dark, and no one was anywhere close enough to hear him. 2 full days passed before anyone reached him. His neighbor, Jewel Estes, found him first. Then his brother Homer made the terrifying crawl in and discovered Floyd alive, mentally sharp, and somehow still making dry jokes in a voice that had been alone in the dark for 48 hours. The passage to reach him was brutally and almost impossibly narrow, so tight that a broad-shouldered man simply could not enter at all. Only the smallest and slimmest people could reach Floyd, which meant that the vast majority of the growing rescue force assembling outside the cave was physically incapable of contributing anything meaningful. A young journalist named William Burke Miller, small and slight, known by his nickname Skeets, worked for the Louisville Courier-Journal and was slim enough to squeeze his body through the passage. He began making the awful crawl in regularly, bringing food, water, whiskey, and a notepad. His dispatches from inside the tunnel describing Floyd's condition, his dry humor, his extraordinary dignity in the face of what should have been a breaking situation, made Floyd Collins a nationwide sensation within days. Radio was new, and Americans were utterly transfixed by it, and the story of the Kentucky caveman trapped alone and alive underground was exactly the kind of raw human drama that the medium was made to amplify. At the peak of the coverage, crowds of 15,000 people gathered on the hillside above Sand Cave. Food vendors and souvenir sellers and carnival barkers set up operations on the frozen ground. Newspaper reporters arrived from cities across the country, and below all of them, 55 feet down in a crack in the Kentucky earth, Floyd Collins lay in the dark and listened to water drip on his face. The dripping water had never once stopped from the first hour. Icy groundwater fell on his exposed skin in a steady, patient, perfectly merciless rhythm. It did not injure him, it simply never stopped, a constant cold percussion against his face and neck, ticking like a clock that was counting down towards something neither he nor anyone above him wanted to name. Rescue attempts failed one after another in ways that seemed almost designed to maximize despair. Workers tried to hoist Floyd with rope and harness and could not navigate the angled passage. They attempted to widen the tunnel with hand tools and nearly brought the ceiling down entirely. The teenage boys sent into the passage to deliver food and blankets became frightened in the narrowing dark and stuffed the supplies into wall cracks instead of pushing forward. Floyd received almost none of what was sent to him. After 9 agonizing days, the roof of the passage directly above Floyd Collins collapsed. He was sealed in, completely and permanently cut off from any human contact. No more food, no more warmth, no more voices, no more light of any kind. Just the cold pressing stone, the relentless drip of water on his face, and the kind of silence that has weight. The only remaining option was to sink a rescue shaft straight down from the surface. Engineers plotted the position, workers dug through the winter ground around the clock in rotating shifts. The carnival above kept selling refreshments while Floyd Collins lay dying directly beneath the midway. The shaft reached him on February 16, 1925, 17 days after he first fell into the trap. Rescuers lowered themselves down and pushed through to where he lay. Floyd Collins was dead. The coroner estimated he had died around February 13th of exposure and starvation in the absolute dark, 3 full days before the shaft reached him. The story did not end there. Floyd's body was eventually moved to Crystal Cave, the one too far from the road to succeed, placed in a glass-topped coffin and exhibited to paying tourists for years while families filed past and his face looked up at them through the glass lid. Then in March of 1929, his body was stolen from the coffin in the night. It was found in a field nearby. His left leg, the one the boulder had pinned, the one that had pressed against cold limestone for 17 days, the limb that started all of this, was never recovered. It remains missing to this day. No explanation was ever given. No one was ever charged. Floyd Collins spent his whole life convinced he was one great discovery away from everything changing for the better. He was right about that. He found his cave. He found his highway. He found the discovery that would make his name known across the entire country. His story was broadcast into living rooms in every state. Songs were written about him, poems, newspaper editorials. Floyd Collins became the most famous man in America for 3 weeks in January and February of 1925. He just never got to enjoy any of it. He never found his way back up from the dark, and the dark never offered to let him go. Thank you for sticking around till the end. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the stories. I will be back again next week with new stories shared by real people. Comment below to let me know which story terrified you. Thanks again for supporting the channel.